Welcome to the Compassion Podcast, brought to you by the Global Compassion Coalition. In today's episode, Dr. Michael Yellowbird and GCC President Dr. Rick Hanson discuss the topic of decolonizing mindfulness and using neuroscience research to examine how mindfulness approaches and traditional Indigenous contemplative practices can train the mind and positively change the structure and function of the brain. They discuss the effects of colonization and methods of decolonization, including neurodecolonization, which involves combining mindfulness approaches with traditional and contemporary secular and sacred contemplative practices to replace negative patterns of thought, emotion, and behavior with healthy, productive ones.
Dr. Michael Yellowbird is a citizen of the three affiliated tribes, the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara nations. And if I've mispronounced anything, please correct me. He is presently living in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. He is the author of numerous scholarly articles and the co-editor of 4 books: For Indigenous Eyes Only, the Decolonization Handbook; For Indigenous Minds Only, Indigenous Social Work Around the World Towards Culturally Relevant Education and Practice, and Decolonizing Social Work, which won a Choice Outstanding Academic Title Award for 2014. His teaching, writing, research, presentations, and community work focus on social work with Indigenous peoples, Indigenous and global health, decolonizing social work approaches, neurodecolonization, neuroscience and social work, and employing mainstream and traditional Indigenous mindfulness practices in tribal communities to promote health and well-being. And I'm very pleased to be able to add that most recently, Michael Yellowbird has joined the board of the Global Compassion Coalition and honoring us with his wisdom and his presence. So, Michael, thank you. Thank you for being here.
No, thanks, Rick. Appreciate the introduction.
Yeah. Well, so let's just jump right in. Okay. So my first question, and I'm speaking and asking from the context of myself, straight white man, grew up in California, born in 1952, American, et cetera, with a lot of privilege that travels with that and a narrowing of perspective. So acknowledging that for a start, you've done really interesting work drawing on the notion of colonization and its effects on the brains, notably the brains of Indigenous people. And so I wonder if we could just get right into it and start there. How? What are some of the ways for a general audience that colonization of Indigenous people affects their own brains?
Yeah, I think, well, it's really a great question, and thanks for the question. Colonization, I think, we don't think about colonization as being part of the North American landscape, first of all. We think that, we go back to the myths of the founding of the United States and Canada and freedom and declarations of independence and all those kinds of things. So what's lost, I think, in the narrative is what happens to the original people that, are affected by settlers moving into the territory. And it's happened, globally as well. So colonization, of course, is this whole idea where you get these folks or these invasive species or whatever it is moving into the territory of another, right? Which is pretty clear what happened in the pandemic. We had people entering into the territory of animals and bats and different kinds of creatures, of course, and then picking up the virus and spreading it. It's zoonotic, so it jumps into people. Mm-hmm. So in the process, that's what colonization is that it's the invasion and the subjugation of particular groups of people, by other groups of people, and that who change the landscape, they change the geography of, what people are, who they are, their memory, their identity, those kinds of things. And after a while, a particular kind of colonization called settler colonialism says it eliminates the native and sort of eliminates them from history, eliminates them from the landscape, eliminates them, from the memory, those kinds of things. So as all of that is happening, the people that survive colonialism go through a number of processes: oppression, poverty, a marginalization, all those different kinds of things.
Mm.
And it's like that with any population that hasn't been exposed to the ideas, the beliefs, the viruses, the diseases of another population. Take a heavy toll on that group.
Mm.
How does a person's brain get colonized? How do our emotions get colonized? Well, it's through psychological warfare. It's through even the change of diet has a very, very profound effect on Indigenous people, moving from hunter-gatherer diets, many of them, to diets where people consume a lot of mainstream, produce, that's pesticide laden, and it's low on fiber. All these different kinds of things that affect the microbiome of Indigenous people. That affects their emotional health and affects their brain, affects them physically. They end up with chronic diseases like heart disease, diabetes, hypertension, all those different kinds of metabolic diseases. So when you look at the statistics now, you'll see that globally that's happening with Maori people, Aboriginal folks and Indigenous folks in Australia, with First Nations in Canada. You see that happening with Native Americans in the United States. So colonization just really has all these different features about it that affect us spiritually, psychologically, nutritionally, geographically, all these different kinds of ways. So.
And those, of course, feed back into the 3 pounds of tofu-like tissue inside the coconut, our own, precious brains. Are there any particular changes in the brains, let's say, that are related to these colonizing forces, including the chronic stress and trauma and disruption that travels with colonization?
Yeah, I think some of the stuff I've looked at is the effects of what happens to what we call dendritic spines in the prefrontal cortex of the brain. They're very delicate. We all have these dendritic spines, and they do a pretty good job of being stimulated by sensory experiences. Loving touches, caring touches. They're also really important for memory and learning. We know that when people are under chronic stress, it doesn't matter if you're colonized or not. You're under chronic stress, the dendritic spines begin to break. They're very fragile because there's a protein called kinase C, an enzyme that begins to break them down, which I refer to as enzymatic colonization of the brain. I think about how that happens to folks, that have this one layer of chronic stress. You put another layer of historical trauma, generational trauma on that, and you put another layer where people live with fear. They live with marginalization, with racism, hate crimes, those kinds of things. Those kinds of things, I think, up them, and then we can expect a higher degradation of those dendritic spines, which of course are there. They're meant to protect us. They're meant to, be part of our learning and our memory experience and our sensual touch experience and so on. We also know from research that the more your dendritic spines are degraded in the prefrontal cortex, the higher risk you are for dementias like Alzheimer's and those kinds of things. So that's pretty clear that the research has kind of borne that out. We also know that there's a lot of research that's been done with telomeres at the end of the chromosomes. Yeah. We know that chronic stress can shorten telomeres. We know there's a lot of research that shows that people or kids that live in very stressful environments have a quicker degrading of their telomeres. We know that, which again, the telomeres are at the end of the chromosomes. As they degrade, the aging diseases come on a lot faster. Yeah. So we know that happens a lot with Indigenous people. They're biologically aged quicker, especially folks like myself and others who have had ancestors who have been starved, herded onto reservations, have been, controlled and really in that way felt unsafe and not had the ability to be liberated, those many years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, whatever it is. We still carry those markers, those telomeres down. I've seen that. I've done my own DNA analysis. I've done my own, looked at my mom's analysis, and I knew what kind of life she had, the kind of life her mother had, my great-grandmother had.
Yeah.
And we saw, the telomeres being passed down from one generation to the next as we take a look at those genetic tests. I inherited a number of, shorter telomeres. So like all, children that are born in a stressed world where mothers are very, affected by these life factors, send on these telomeres to the babies, and babies born biologically older. We know that too as well. So there's just so many mechanisms there. So we could go on and on about that. But suffice it to say that colonialism and the pressures of colonialism, the removal of people from their land, the loss of their identity, the racism that comes from it, the disproportionate number of diseases, all sort of conspire together to create this perfect storm of ill health and low life expectancy and so on.
Thank you. I was just very struck in what you were saying by a kind of analog in that, as you well know, these dendritic spines enable the billions of neurons in our head to connect with each other,
right.
And those connections get disrupted. And that's an analog to the larger disconnection when people are uprooted and profoundly mistreated,
right.
as well, from the rootedness in the world. Yeah.
I mean, you can bet, Rick, that right now the war in Ukraine that's happening now, that all those mothers that are experiencing this traumatic stress, this prolonged, it's been 18 months of war right now, and the exposure to these these very toxic images and this this really, really frightening stuff they're going through are probably going to pass on a generation of shortened telomeres to the next, and we'll see the effects of that years from now in the next generations of survivors from that war. So
yeah. Okay. So maybe starting to think about what can we do about this at the individual scale, and then we'll move to the more collective scale. What are some traditional indigenous contemplative practices distinct from the secular mindfulness approaches that many of us are familiar with? You talk about bringing in traditional indigenous contemplative practices. Could you speak to some of what those are?
Sure. A lot of now, again, it's really important to remember that the U.S. In particular. I mean, I'll talk about the U.S. since I'm from the U.S. I'm living in Canada, but the U.S. took great pains to outlaw, to ban, and to prevent Indigenous people from practicing a lot of contemplative spiritual practices, and there's a lot of research, a lot of historical sort of evidence that leaders who are practicing contemplative practices were jailed. They were, their families the whole community was starved of rations when they were on reservations. So there was that kind of thing that was happening. So it's a lot of these things had to make a comeback, and they're still making a comeback. It's contemplative practices. Some of them are, when people actually, one's called a sundance, when people go out to sundance in the northern plains. So they spend time 4 days out fasting, 4 days out praying in the elements, 4 days, of being around one another, offering prayers, not just for themselves or for their tribal groups, but for the world, praying for the world, praying for peace, praying for, goodness of the world. So people are out there fasting and offering, different kinds of sacrifices of skin, just like, the Jews did back in the time of Pontius Pilate and Jesus when they offered blood, as sacrifice. So human cultures have done that for a long time, offering something. And those were banned for quite a while. They're making a comeback now, and a lot of people spend a lot of time in a very contemplative space in that for those 4 or 5 days. Sometimes people come in and they begin 4 days early, and they go into deep meditative practice. 4 days during the ceremony and 4 days after the ceremony. So it's 12 days in total where people are doing that. So it's that's one thing that folks do. Another thing that people do are a lot of dances. Back in the past, so many tribes did so many different kinds of contemplative dances. I've been fortunate growing up. I saw a number of these dances as a child where different tribes would come into our community in North Dakota. They would do buffalo dances. They would mimic the spirit of the buffalo, bear dances, eagle dances, deer dances, all these different kinds of things that would, I guess it was sort of connecting with the spirit of the animal and seeing, the power and kind of touching and making relatives with animals and that sort of thing. So a number of different kinds of dances. A lot of times people will sit, in a sweat lodge. And in the sweat lodge, they'll sing for, many, many songs and have many, many prayers and that sort of thing. So a lot of people, I think, have been maybe, maybe listening, some people have been in the sweat lodge. So again, that was another thing that was banned and of course made its way back. So those are some of the more contemporary things. There are a lot of ceremonies that happen that are, from different tribes, where they engage themselves in very deep kinds of spiritual practice, sometimes that are closed to the community, sometimes that are closed to everyone, except, just a few folks. Among my people, the Arikara people, that was, people used to do buffalo dances and bear dances, but also I had a grandfather called Bear's Teeth that did contemplative practices to call in the rains. He was a rainmaker. So, people say, well, do a rain dance, the Hollywood stuff, and they would, sort of ridicule that. But, this was the power that some people had. I'm not saying everybody can do it, but, it was pretty clear that one of my grandfathers, Bear's Teeth, and you can find him if you search him on the web, Bear's Teeth Arikara, he could call in the rain, and it was observed by many outsiders when he did call in the rain, right? Another modern day person who was able to do that was a guy by the name of Leonard Crow Dog, who is a Lakota from Pine Ridge, South Dakota. I've never seen him do it, but people would say he could call in the rains. And so people would get in these very deep contemplative spaces. And I know it's kind of like where they get in this spot where they do this so much, like they get the 10,000 hours or whatever it is, to kind of move them, to this place where their gamma wave, band waves change and those kinds of things. But they begin to, they blur the lines between, being physically here and, being with the clouds or being with the rain or being with the rivers or being with whatever it is. Just like the Buddha, that, when he reached the point of enlightenment, that's one of the things, the first thing he did was to touch the earth, because the earth could experience, him having this point of enlightenment when Mara was saying, who's going to witness this, right? And the Buddha, just like many other, I think, contemplative masters and leaders and practitioners, was very much like a lot of the indigenous people do have the same kind of knowledge and the same kind of connection, with plants and animals, with sacred landscapes, with waters, that kind of thing. So a lot of that contemplative stuff takes, practices takes place in these different kinds of spaces. Some people do a lot of, they used to call it, vision quest. A lot of people still do a lot of individual things like that, from where I'm from. They still do that. They still make these pilgrimages to sacred sites on different reservations in different places, and spend time out there doing their contemplative practice. And almost, 99% of the people are doing that are involved in a contemplative practice that would bring peace to the world, that would bring, people together, that bring compassion, those kinds of things, right? And of course, some people are looking for healing and that kind of thing. So a lot of people do it in the lands, they're or near the waters or in the mountains, near the rivers, those kinds of things. And more and more that's happening with the youth. Indigenous youth are being brought back to these places through land-based education. So.
Thank you. So how can these kind of practices, and perhaps woven together, which is something you also do with secular mindfulness practices that are increasingly well known, how can these kind of practices help to decolonize the mind and the brain, which is making the mind, like the enchanted loom, as Sherrington, the neuroscientist, put it a long time ago, weaving the fabric of consciousness. So people doing these practices, and maybe even some suggestions from you specifically for what people can do themselves to use these kind of practices, perhaps integrated with other secular mindfulness approaches, to decolonize their own brains, their own minds. What can people do?
I think the first thing really is intention. It's always about intention. Why do you want to do this? What's it about? How does it serve? Within an indigenous lens, it's like how do you serve the greater good, right? It's not, it's the nucleus accumbens. It gets shrunken, right? That part of the brain that says it's all about me, it's shrunken, and once it starts to shrink, it's all about us, not just about me. So I think the intention, with folks is that reach to begin with, reach beyond yourself, right? This is
Mm.
kind of more in indigenous ways. Reach beyond yourself, reach to the stars, reach to the community, reach to the, all the sentient, things that exist in the world around you. The pilgrimage should be that, to kind of lose yourself along the way, right? And to kind of begin to connect with, these other sentient life forms. They have their names, in our language and in our culture, and in their language and culture, it means something when you talk to them and you call to them. And there are always guardians that exist, throughout the world, over these places, right? And the connection to those things is really critical, I think. So that's to kind of stay open to the possibility that there's connections that can happen.
Mm.
The other thing I think is to move outside. We evolved to move outside, to be
Mm.
outside, to be in the sunshine, to be in the cold, to be in the heat, those kinds of things, to the grasses, those kinds of and we when people go out, I think that's really important to kind of make that a really regular part of a contemplative practice, is being out somewhere, wherever it is, and having some kind of connection to a place that gives you, some kind of sense of balance. So I think those are critical. But again, it's like it doesn't happen right away. And Rick, from from all the research that's gone on, it takes many, actually thousands of hours to accomplish this. But once a person begins to do these kinds of things, we begin to build up that space. We begin to build up that that accumulation of that good that comes to relating to these places. So we know that the olfactory system is very powerful, and it's one of the things that I've been studying more recently, because a lot of indigenous people use a lot of different kinds of sacred plants as sludge, like sweetgrass, tobacco, cedar, a lot of sage, a lot of things like that. And I just encourage people to kind of to do those kinds of things, those kinds of smells that bring a sense of groundedness to you. I saw recently a bit of research where it talks about people that sleep with certain kind of smells at night actually reduce their chance of dementia, right? And there's some science developing about the importance of the pathophysiology of, the physiology of smell, right? And so it's getting to go to these places, and the brain is an integrated system, sight, sound, taste, touch, smell, and then there's that other sense of just being, of picking up whatever vibration, whatever exists there, And I co-authored a book recently with a colleague, Chris Clark, who's a good friend of mine, who's in Finland. She's a social professor there. And I told a story in the book about how one of my sons was thrown from a horse when we were back home in North Dakota. So my father suggested I take him to his grandfather to do a ceremony. And he did a ceremony for my son, to kind of remove the trauma from that. What I didn't know is he was going to do a lot more. And what he did is take us then to the horse that had thrown my son. He did a ceremony around the horse. So I thought he was done. So then he said, no, we're not done. So we go back. He said, where did this happen? So I showed him. So he did a ceremony over all the earth there, of all the plants and everything that witnessed, this, what had happened. He said, these kinds of things are things that we don't do like we used to do. He said, we used to have such a close relationship with the land that, when we moved through a place, the land and it understood us. We understood the land. We had this sort of, synchronistic kind of relationship, because we observed and we spent a lot of time there. So I think the key thing is spending time there and becoming familiar and realizing that these places do hold magic. They do hold healing power. They do have all kinds of important, lessons for us to learn. So,
yeah. Wow. Just picking up on your point about thousands of hours on that journey, even the first step matters, of course.
Right.
And as you know, there's evidence that we can actually start producing lasting changes in our own brain through deliberate internal practice fairly quickly, even along the way, to be sure. I think about, speaking of a different kind of indigenous rootedness in Tibet 1,500 years ago, 1,000 years ago. Milarepa, one of the great sages, you may know this, he was looking back on his whole life, and he was asked basically to kind of sum it up. And he basically said, in terms of his life of practice, in the beginning, nothing came. In the middle, nothing stayed. In the end, nothing left. And a lot of us, I think, are in that first two steps there, trying to get something going. We can't quite feel it yet. But then in the second step, we're starting to really feel it. But it hasn't yet lodged in us as a shift of trait. And yet, over time, it doesn't leave. And we're at home already, increasingly, as we move out into the world.
Yeah, it's really an interesting story. I know that story. One of my grandfathers said one time, I was having conversation with him at a Sundance, and he said, when he didn't call it enlightenment, he called this place where it's understanding, I guess.
Yeah.
He said when we reach that point is when we really understand, that we have to let go of all attachments, right? We have to let go of these things that hold us back.
Yeah.
Which is why he's told me, he said, why we practice as a tribe, always giving away. We have these big giveaways in our community. We give away all these material things, and we give away all these things that are important to us. And then another uncle was telling me one time, I had all these eagle feathers, right? I was telling him I was asked, to give an eagle feather to this young man, and so he said, "Let me see them." So I opened them up, and he said, "Which one are you thinking?" So I grabbed one, and he looked at it, and he said, "This one's better, right?" And he took the one that was the one that I wanted to keep. He said, "I could tell that you wanted to keep that one." He said, "Is that right?" I said, "Yeah, that's right." He said, "That's what," he said, "keeps you in this place." He said, "is you don't let go of those kinds of things." He said, "Once you let go," he said, "then," and this is what he told me, and I've heard several times, "they come back to you in different kinds of ways, right? All his gifts or his teachings, his wisdom, and that kind of thing." So I think that's, those are some things I've learned as I grew up, and I've been involved in ceremony, and I've been lucky to be around some very spiritual people. So
when people do these kind of practices that you're describing, to what extent is it useful to bring them into contact with the residues, I'll call them that, of colonization in their minds, in their heart, in their being, so that the healing power, the restorative, nurturing impact of these practices can directly ease and soothe and even uproot the residues internalized of colonization? Do you play around with that?
Yeah. I mean, it certainly has in the past, even before European colonization, American colonization. Indigenous people had a number of different kinds of ways to deal with traumatic experiences.
Yeah.
We've been through climate change before. That's pretty clear. 10,000 years ago, there was major climate change happening, in the North American continent, Turtle Island. So how did people survive that, right? What did they do? We know there was disease that happened. It wasn't the infectious chronic diseases, of the Europeans, but there were different kinds of diseases. There were different kinds of periods where people went through starvation and hardship and so on. So one of the things I've discovered in some of the research that I've done is that, we've also developed different kinds of things that are protective, to us, and those things have kind of filtered down, I think. And you look at the some of the psychology that looks at children today. We understand that there are what they call dandelion kids, the dandelion kids that are the tough kids. They walk on fire. They can go through trauma and they can swim out of it, right? And they shake themselves off and they move on. There are the orchid kids, right? The very delicate ones that are, beautiful spirits, and they're artists, and they're musicians, they're poets, they're lovers, they're really sensitive people. So sensitivity has been looked at in that way, and we know that they need a lot more support, from folks. So when you look at indigenous populations, what kinds of ceremonies produced a combination of the both, right? Sensitive but tough, right? They call them the tulip kids now today, right? And I think some of the things that were the rites of passage that kids had to go through were very clearly some of the things, that created what we would call, hormesis, right? They would get to this point where they, maybe as young people, they would have to go without food for a while. They would be training under elders, and they would have to work all day and not eat for a couple of days to kind of experience that. Their bodies, not when they were babies or anything like that, but when they were young men and young women, would go through this period of hormesis. And we know that what happens with that, and these are traditional rites of passage ceremonies, could be dancing, could be singing without food, could be sitting in a hot, sweat lodge, or swimming across ice cold rivers, could all be part of strengthening, the kid, the young people. We know that when people go through that, a lot of Mark Mattson's work, says, whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And that's exactly what our cells do. They respond and they get stronger, so that a lot of these ceremonies that were healthy stress to people,
healthy. That's the key part.
Healthy stress
rather than traumatic stress. Yeah.
Right. Got people prepared for those kinds of things. And a lot of that happened in ceremony, whether, like I said, it was going without food, praying for long periods of time, and expecting some young people to stay focused on something, in a prayer, or focused on, a sacred object or whatever it is. So those kinds of things begin to strengthen the cells of the body, right? We know that something else that happened too, when you put yourself in that position. Now we know from a lot of studies in human microbiome, when people run on an empty stomach, and like young people used to do, they run on an empty stomach singing prayer songs to the earth, right? They run for miles, not hard, but they run and they do this call and call back response. We look at all the research there and think, wow, these dynamic things are happening in the body. Endocannabinoids are rising in the brain that make them feel better. The mood improves, right? The brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, begins to rise, and it protects the brain cells, and it creates neurogenesis in the brain. So we see all these things that are happening that, as people begin to run along, and you've got to, let's say I'm leading. I'm an elder, kind of leading on these young boys on a run. They haven't eaten for 2 days. We're out there running. We're singing a prayer song to the sun or to the clouds or whatever it is. I sing it, they call back. I sing it, they call back. That's part of the ceremony. So, but we know biologically what's happening now as they do that kind of thing. Spiritually, they're feeling stronger. They're feeling more connected. But we see that, it's like I was saying, a lot of these studies that, the cells are being stressed, but they're responding and they're getting stronger. Brain-derived neurotrophic factor, endocannabinoids, all these things are all rising, and it's protecting the brain, protecting the body, protecting the cells. And, it guards against the stress that comes from these, events that happen. Why we've succumbed so much to colonization in terms of our present health is because we don't do those ceremonies like we used to do. Right. And that's the whole idea, is to begin to return back to these things, to begin to strengthen the resilience of Indigenous people. Right. So,
with lessons for all of humanity.
All of humanity. Yep.
Yeah. I'm struck by what you're saying when I think about myself. So my own version of that is to go into my garage alone and get on my treadmill and lift weights and things like that.
Yeah.
Typical style, individualistically. And so much of what you're describing is a context of community and relatedness, cross-generational relatedness, in which people do individual practices.
Yeah.
And that aspect of community and human relatedness and context seems so central to decolonizing our brains and broadly building, healthy bodies and minds. Maybe you could speak more about that.
Yeah, I think there's some good research that about dancing, for instance, that says we evolved to move in that way, and we evolved to dance. And this guy Berglund, I'm trying to remember his research, but said that it really appears that human cultures evolved to dance in synchronicity, to do things in synchronized fashion. And it really reminded me of bird murmurations. Have you ever seen those murmurations of these thousands of birds that fly in these patterns, just very tight patterns? Oh, yeah. And I was looking at that, thinking about that, how when I used to watch Indigenous people dance, how dancing in unison, is a very powerful act. And that evolved. Then of course all these other things that are going on along with it, right? All these other biological things that are happening in the body. So as we do things together as a group, I think we understand, from some of the research that I've looked at, and especially when I've looked at research on in applying it to some of our ancient, or more, I guess, past ceremonies, like a bear dance, for example. When all the men were out there, I wish I could pull up a copy of that, where all the men were out there with their gourds singing, and they're standing there. You've got about 6 people. When you look at, the Western science, what's happening, in the brains of these guys? Well, the first thing we see some activation of oxytocin. It's a group. They're doing something together. They're brothers in arms, right? Brothers in spirit, and they're singing this song. So we get the rise of oxytocin. We also see, when these things are happening in a group, cortisol levels begin to go down. Right? And as they anticipate, this warrior song, this strong spirit song, or the connection with the sacred, dopamine levels begin to go up already. The reward of that happening begins to go up, right? And these are just a few of the things that I've seen when I think about why are these folks doing these dances back in the day? How did it serve them? And the words of the songs then began to become very clear to me. Of the words, what they said, how they're connected to the earth, how they're connected to the sun, how they're connected to the water, and how they're connected to one another, and how they're connected to even the smallest ant or whatever it is. They're connected to these things as they feel the spirit of all these things. And of course, this neurochemistry is just exploding in very positive ways. And the other, if it's norepinephrine that's going on, it's not the craziness of norepinephrine, like I'm so alert because danger, but I'm alert to this really wonderful thing that's happening, right? And so even I've seen some research on hunter-gatherer indigenous people in the I think it's the Bolivian rainforest, where they took levels of oxytocin and before the men went out for a hunt. Wasn't too high. After the hunt was done, of course, their levels of testosterone up. But as they got closer and closer to the village to bring back the game and what they had gotten, their levels of oxytocin began to climb and climb and climb, because they were thinking about and singing about how they were bringing food to the people they love, right? They were bringing a gift to people. So, these are things I think that are really important to think about, when you're involved in a group setting, that, that kind of chemistry begins to happen. And the more you do it, the stronger it gets, right? So.
I wonder if I could ask you kind of a particularly personal question, which is simply that, given all that you know, I'm so struck, really, and really learning here from so much that you know, given what you do know about your own brain, your own body, your own history, and all the rest. What are the 1 or 2 or 3 things you particularly value doing as practices routinely, even daily?
Yeah. Well, I've written about this recently in an article that's I have to do some cutting down. It was a little long. So, but I wrote about my practice in the morning, and just understanding what my grandfather, his name was Plenty Fox, but he was my great grandfather, who raised my father. And he gave me my father gave me all these stories about him, and I try to live like he lived in some ways. When first thing he wakes up in the morning, before his feet touch the floor, he sings his song, to kind of thank his dreams. So I think about that. I don't always do that, but I think about that. But when the first contemplative practice I do in the morning, when I sit, when I light my smudge, my sage, I say the words that he said. Smoke. Be with me. Smoke. Bless me. I was talking to the smoke. Smoke, make me invisible to all the bad things out there, right? And the spirits of the smoke, be with me today, right? And these are things that I think to me, I've got that personal relationship with that smoke and that story. So and I'm just glad my father gave me that story. So that's one of the things. Another thing I used to do, I don't do as much, but I still run. But when I was professor at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, I used to, do all these running songs. I got up in the morning and I ran, and I used to sing a running song every morning. And again, this comes from my grandfather Plenty Fox, who sang these songs of movement. When you move, the things that you see, this, the clouds bless me, the winds bless me, winds be with me, winds bless me, winds bless everyone, right? And those kinds of things as you run along, and you stay focused on the words. You stay focused on everything that you see. You stay focused on the music and your feet touching the earth, right, on the lap of Mother Earth. So these are things that I've done, things that I hope to begin to teach young men how to do back in my own tribal community again, to bring them back to this place. I've done it with some groups when I lived in California, when I was a professor at Cal Poly Humboldt, which was Humboldt State formerly. Formerly, I used to go down and visit some of the indigenous groups in Southern California and talk to the youth down there and talk about the importance of learning how to do this kind of sacred running, like a lot of these tribal people did, and then to sing it in your language, to express yourself to all the elements of the world. So those are just a couple of things. So
that's great. Some questions have come in, and maybe if you don't mind, I guess my son, the podcast host, calls it a lightning round. So we'll be kind of quick with these. So a few questions here. You can see them probably yourself. First one, and I'll use the name of people because it's visible in the comments for others, from Pippa Sargent. Which scents were used in the dementia study, please?
Oh, the article didn't say. The article didn't say.
Darn, those scientists, they left it
Yeah,
out.
yeah, didn't say. But someone asked me that same question, and I said, I don't know. I said, but I think the scents that are meaningful to people are probably the first ones to start with, right? People say lavender has a healing effect and that sort of thing, but for me, it's I burn a little sage, a little smudge before I go to bed, a little sweetgrass. Depending upon, for me and for a lot of our people in my community. I think, when people burn a little sage, it's for protection, right? Good dreams. If you burn a little sweetgrass, it's to call in the good, right? Come visit me in my dream, sort of stuff, right? So I think that's, again, the article just didn't say so.
Okay. But options for people. That's beautiful.
Yeah.
From Pierre-Luc Gauthier, how to introduce mindfulness in an indigenous community that has lost most of its culture. And I suspect Pierre-Luc would be okay with extending that to how to introduce contemplative practices in general, including indigenous contemplative practices, into an indigenous community that has lost most of its culture.
Yeah, I think, I've had, for whatever reason, a lot of success. I won't call it success, but people have been very open to it when I bring it in, because one of the things I try to do is I try to bring in the overall understanding of, contemplative practices that indigenous people did at one time. And I think people really see a lot of benefit when I talk about the neuroscience and the neurobiology of it as well. Yeah. I'll say, now I know why our ancestors did what they did. Because I think for a long time, colonialism spent a lot of time ridiculing and, disparaging and just banning that, and saying this is all really bad. This is like, devil worship. It's, they had no understanding what it was. And so I think a lot of that, became part of the narrative for a lot of indigenous groups. They didn't know what to think about it. But now today, mindfulness has become, and meditation has become such a widespread thing. When you bring it back to a community and said, this is really part of who we were. And a lot of the elders will say, this is exactly what we did at one time, that we had all this time where we spent, in meditation about good things, when we were weaving rugs or making pottery or making, jewelry or making sacred, bundles or those kinds of things. So I think that's really important, is to kind of show, folks that it's, what it does for the brain, what it does for the body. And that's what I try to do on all of my work when I work with indigenous communities, to say, this is how we got here, by the loss of this stuff. This is how we can get back there by, restoring this. There needs to be a renaissance of this kind of thing. And even, even now the white people agree that, it's good stuff, right? But they said at one time it wasn't, but now all their science is pointing to the reason, which supports and illuminates, what we did as being very important.
That's great. Thank you. Another one from Wafula Masika. Can spirituality, religion play an integral part in decolonizing mindfulness? If yes, what could be the best approach?
Yeah, I think some of the work that Andrew Newberg's done. Andrew Newberg is a person who does neurotheology, and I've used some of his work.
Oh no, I love all the stuff, including the sounds of the birds. And
Right.
you're embedded. You're embedded.
Right.
You're a walking demonstration. Okay.
Yeah. So Andrew Newberg, I was really struck by some of the work that he's done and some of the research he's looked at. So can religion and spirituality fit into mindfulness, and decolonization? Absolutely. We know that we've evolved, and we've survived because a belief in a higher power, whatever that is, right?
Yeah.
Whatever that is. We know that, right? We also know that from the what. So if folks are interested, how God changes your brain is the book that you can find this in. But it's really interesting when I was reading Andrew's book. I said, gosh, this is so interesting that he said that the people that have this different kinds of beliefs. 20% of the people believe in a God that's distant. 20%. There's doing these research in the United States believe in a critical God and a distant God, and only about 25%. Then about 25% or so, 20% of the people believe in a God, a benevolent God, love everybody, love everything, right? Love, and have compassion. And very different parts of the brain are activated, right? The critical God, I'm going to get you and you're going to burn in hell forever, and I'm watching you all the time. The distant God, and the God of retribution, those are the ones that activate the fear part of the brain, right? The amygdala. And once that gets activated, it's like we're living in fear, and we don't feel good. We're just our mistrust. We over fear, all these kinds of things, right? So then the other part of the brain, as I understand, is that the anterior cingulate cortex, where actually there are neurons that relate to compassion, right? So when we believe in a loving God, if we have a religion that believes, in a god or goddess, or a being or an entity or whatever it is that believes in love and acceptance and care and compassion, that part of the brain that's lit up makes us much more plastic in our approach to accepting the differences of other people, accepting other folks, other ideas, and being more compassionate and open, and caring, much more. The other kind of God that's about retribution, makes us care less, makes us more fearful. So of course, spirituality and religion has a place, but it depends upon the belief of the person, is what the research sort of bears out. So.
That's great. I know we're going to be finishing soon, and I want to see if I can slip one kind of last question in relating to where we started, the notion of moving from the individual out to the collective. And one of the things you've written and taught about is the importance of collectivism, or the sense of being part of a larger whole, in contrast to the kind of typical Western rugged individualism, that's so emphasized in capitalism and certainly my culture in America. Can you speak about the wider implications? In the Global Compassion Coalition, we have a vision of a world that is grounded in caring and sharing, which is how our ancestors lived 97% of the time. Humans have walked the earth in hunter-gatherer bands, with compassion and justice actually at the foundation of how they live together. And you've spoken so much about that. So our vision that you're part of as well is trying to find ways to extend that out and to restore, to come home again, to walk each other home, as I started out in the very beginning before you were able to arrive, to how to walk each other home to our birthright with compassion and justice at the foundation of our societies. So I wonder if you could speak about what we can learn from Indigenous people about both the necessity of that and the how of doing that.
Yeah. I think it gets back to how we evolved, as you said, Rick, as human beings. We didn't evolve as individuals. We evolved as groups. We evolved as, and this is why, oxytocin levels will rise when we have this really close connection, even with one other person. Even when we look at a group of people that we love in a picture, oxytocin levels will go up, right? And that's the bonding love kind of chemical. These are my people. If we look at the world, behind that, I think, or the world around us with that kind of thinking, I think, we see that kind of rise in there. If we understand, for example, the trees are actually giving us life. They're making oxygen, right? We have this exchange going on. We're giving them the carbon, dioxide. We've got this exchange going on. If we sit there and contemplate that for a while, we begin to see, that's part of our collectivism. Is just people are one thing, but also all the other kinds of things where you interact with. I've got my dog looking at my window right now at me. She's thinking, can I come out? Anything that we touch, anything we engage with that kind of thing is like, this is my relative. And this is what Indigenous people say. This is my relative. This is something or someone I'm related to, right?
Yeah.
This gives me life. I give them life, right? We have this kind of, this connection, with one another, this really strong conviction of that kind of thing. And I think this is what, Indigenous people have learned, is that connection to all these things, in this collectivist kind of way is very important. With human beings, the thing that we can do, that Indigenous people, and it's, again, these are, across all cultures. And we evolved as hunter-gatherers, many of us. Many of us have a particular gene called the serotonin transporter gene. If you look that up, serotonin transporter gene, that is a 5-HTT-LPR, I believe it is, gene. It's kind of the location. That expresses for humor and laughter. If you see how contagious it is, there's some people have made videos and posted them online where you've got this complete stranger that gets on a bus or a subway and he starts looking at a laptop with whatever's on there. He starts laughing and giggling and laughing. Pretty soon the whole bus is laughing, right? There's a connection that happens, right, with that laughter and humor. Yeah. Jokes, funny stories, comic, kinds of situations are part of this collectivism. We tell these stories of how we survive, of how we persist, of our resilience, of how we crash and burn, but how people, the spirits, the nature of the plants pick us up and we rise again, right? That's all part of the collectivist story that we have as human beings, and why we can go back and look at all cultures at one time that had that kind of connection. So. And we have, as I say, if you've got a couple of variants of this particular serotonin transporter gene, you got what I call it the funny bone gene, and you laugh. That expression, comes across as friendliness, as openness, as to other people. The smile is the same thing. Try walking down the street and just smile at people, just smile, right, and watch what happens. At the end of your walk for 10 or 15 minutes. Try walking a half an hour if you want to do it. And after 15 or 20 minutes of just smiling at people, and see how many people smile back that you don't even know. And at the end of that, how you're feeling. And I can bet you your oxytocin levels are up, your dopamine levels are up, your cortisol is down. And this has all happened, with a collectivist group of people that you don't even know, but they're part of your community that are waiting to be connected to you. So.
Oh, that's great. And never underestimating the ripple effects of these seemingly small actions, including the ripple effects inside you, but certainly outside you as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, I hope there are many, and I believe there will be many good ripple effects from this conversation reaching out into the world. I want to thank you for your time here, Michael, and it's always just a delight, really, in my heart to be with you and learn from you. And I'm so glad you're part of the Global Compassion Coalition. So thank you, and thank you. Bows back.
Thank you.
This podcast was brought to you by the Global Compassion Coalition. To access more content like this, as well as resources integrating compassion into your daily routine, make sure to subscribe to this podcast and visit our website at globalcompassioncoalition.org.